So how did France emerge from World War II? Well, a lot of that had to do with the experience of France for most French people. Now, France, which had lost the most men to World War I in proportion to the population, entire generations, as I've talked about before, entered the war with resignation. And in fact, at the beginning, there was an absence of actual conflict on French territory, and this is because of the result of decisions made by Hitler. This led to what the French called the phony war, because it did not seem to be the war they had experienced in World War I. So for the French people, the 9 months of the phony war were filled with, in fact, nervous anticipation, stress, and boredom. Now they were finally invaded, and to their shock, defeated. On June 22nd, 1940, France signed the armistice, capitulating to Germany. It was now an occupied nation. And in fact, like a lot of Western and Eastern European countries, but the Germans resisted, really engaging in complete violence on French soil. So France was divided in two parts, occupied and unoccupied. Occupied in the north and unoccupied in the south. So it had become a semi-independent state. Now, the right and the far right blamed defeat on the nation's decadence, that is, on the gain and progress of the interwar period. And Parliament of the Third Republic voted full powers to the Vichy regime, headed by World War I hero Maréchal Pétain, now who was himself a conservative. Now, what were the values of Pétain and the Vichy regime? They were conservative and right-wing. The idea was to overthrow Republican universalism, to end parliamentary democracy, and institute an authoritarian government anchored by the values of family and homeland. This means that married women were forbidden to work. Women were only to be mothers, and anti-Semitism was also a central principle. Now remember, there were just under 350,000 Jews in France by the beginning of the war. And on October 1940, the Vichy government enacted the first Jewish statute, as it was called. That is, it excluded Jews from the army, the civil service, the industry, the press, whether they were French or not. And they arrested and forced foreign Jews to go into detainment camps, as well as denaturalizing them. That is, those who had been given citizenship, French citizenship in the 1930s, had it stripped away from them. In 1942, as in most of Europe, things took a turn for the worse, and the French government arrested and detained and helped in the deportation, organizing the deportation of French and foreign Jews. This was to haunt France, but not realized until many, many years later. In the meantime, when France was liberated, even though the spectacle was joyful, life did not immediately improve. There were very harsh winters. In 1944 and 1945, food, coal, and gasoline were scarce. And in fact, the American writer Saul Bellow said that in 1946, Paris was one of the grimmest cities of the world. Now, this is the moment when many returned from the front. First and foremost, prisoners of war who had languished in camps. Those civilians who had been forcibly conscripted into forced labor for the Nazis and deported to Germany for that purpose, but also concentration and labor camp inmates. In fact, 65,000 had been deported and just 48% returned. Now, of Jewish survivors, the numbers were uneven and bleak. Of the 75,000 French and foreign Jews that the Vichy government had arrested and deported in 1942, only 3% returned. even if overall 75% of the French Jewish community survive. So the situation was indeed bleak. But there was also a desire to overcome and take vengeance on what had just taken place and who was responsible for it, leading to violence and calls for justice and retribution. These were both spontaneous and organized. For instance, there were over 7,000 summary executions before the liberation in 1944 and 400 after. The head shaving of women took place as early as 1944, just under 25,000 women, and these were spontaneous acts by communities, very often with the help of the local police and authorities. And in fact, the government decided to organize purge trials as a way of curtailing and domesticating these spontaneous acts of violence so that the nation could become unified again after the divisions of the war. And a series of trials took place between 1945 and 1951. These involved leading politicians such as Maréchal Pétain, but also his Prime Minister Laval, as well as writers and intellectuals like Robert Brasillac. Laval and Pétain were condemned and executed, but Pétain's death sentence was commuted. In total, there were almost 5,000 trials, and by the early 1950s, those still imprisoned were either pardoned or released. And in the context of the very rapidly emerging myth that France had, as a whole, had resisted the occupier, thereby erasing the realities and complexities of the Vichy government and the war years, deportees were now celebrated. But they were celebrated first and foremost as political deportees and resistors. The images of those who had returned and that had been waiting for their loved ones at the Hotel Lutetia, in fact, were in everybody's mind. And in Paris, the situation was still dire. There was rationing of bread until 1948. And the population did not return to its 1936 level until 1946. And in fact, much of Paris remained rather empty. People could be found in the middle-class suburbs or in the shanty towns where Algerian workers and their families were housed, and that I'll talk about next time. So reconstruction was urgent, and the reopening of businesses was urgent too. So the government nationalized electricity, the gas industry, the car industry, and those began thriving. The first car show opened in 1946, and the national income, the average national income and consumption increased by a third from 1949 to 1958. And this is in part thanks to the support provided by the Marshall Plan. The slums in Paris were also targeted for reconstruction, and these were made into these utopian ideals of social housing and modern living that now populated Paris instead of the slums and the shanty towns. And in 1946, a law was passed closing brothels, which had been legal since the 19th century. Now, cinema and fashion dominated the news and the cover pages of the magazines as the new economic and political forces, whether it be with the Festival de Cannes, which now became a worldwide event, or the incredible success of the Christian Dior fashion house. And politically, things changed quickly and rapidly. After the demise of the Vichy regime, the Fourth Republic was instituted, and the provisional government gave women the right to vote. In fact, it had already issued that right in 1945, but it was made into a law in 1946. Now, this is in the context of labor unrest and strikes, which allowed for the rise and the popularity of the Communist Party as a substantial political force. And this is possible because, in fact, the Communists were the first one to resist the Nazis. Historically, they were anti-fascist, and a large part of the resistance had been communists. So, at the first municipal elections in Paris in the spring of 1945, the first elections where women voted, communists won 37% of the vote and earned 27 council seats out of the 90. They were the largest party on the city council. This is also in the wake and of other political developments. And in October 1945, the first parliamentary elections were held, won by a coalition of socialists and communists, even if the provisional government had been led by the conservative hero of World War II, Charles de Gaulle. Now, however, things changed very quickly. In October 1947, at the municipal elections in Paris, it is Charles de Gaulle's conservative party, the Rassemblement du Peuple Français, which now became the majority and won 52 seats out of 90. The communists still kept 25, and the socialists won only 5. Now, the response from communists and trade unions was immediate. Strikes were organized by metal workers, industry workers, public employees, teachers, and a general strike was called for. It was called off on December 9th, but labor unrest continued. So politics mattered tremendously in a context of urgent reconstruction after the disarray and the destruction wrought by World War II. And this is the context in which young people started populating the basement jazz clubs and other places where they felt they could reinvent the world. Those that also wanted to reinvent the world were the intellectuals, writers, and artists who were committed to a left-wing program, and especially the existentialists led by Jean-Paul Sartre, a philosopher, and Simone de Beauvoir, that we will read, who were at the forefront of this new existentialist movement.